I'm Guy Poppy. I'm leading the Assets project, which I'm about to talk to you about, and the team will no doubt help me with the questions. And we can't bring people in from Africa, but some of the more social science part of the team are all in Africa at the moment, which we'll be joining them on Friday. So we're the Assets project, and we're talking of websites earlier, but we have developed a website which is in a draft form at the moment. But we're also started to use Facebook and Twitter, which I think is a useful thing to do from the outset. And we've had discussions over coffee in terms of impact and that. And I've noticed through things like Twitter, you can get impact to some extent in terms of United Nations, World Bank, etc., picking up what you're doing and retweeting it, etc. So I think it's a good way to certainly start off. This is the team, which involves 5 institutions who actually have co-PIs, Conservation International from Washington, D.C., but also their Colombian office, the Basque Center for Climate Change, CIAT from Cali in Colombia, working together with Colombian universities and several other institutions in Colombia, and Chancellor College in Malawi, working together with World Fish and Rhodes University in South Africa. And like many of the other talks before, the actual disciplines in these teams range from economists and hydrologists through to ecologists and agricultural scientists. So there's a big range of people involved in our project. And in fact, they can't be here, but they beamed some photos to me just yesterday. And this is actually not live, clearly, but because the internet's not up for it. But this is a photo taken yesterday from the training workshops which are occurring in Zomba at this moment in time. This is a group of children from the Lower Caquetá area, of which Erwin, who works for CI's office in Colombia, took a picture, and it illustrates the kind of the participatory approach in terms of understanding from the communities how they view the ecosystems. And it kind of illustrates that the overarching goal of our project is to explicitly quantify the linkages, which is obviously something that a community can't do, and that's where some of the modelling, etc., that comes in, between the natural ecosystem services that affect and are affected by food security and nutritional health for the rural poor at the forest agriculture interface. And I think that is our goal, and that is something we will keep in mind as we develop all parts of the project and collect data, etc., accordingly. So if you take that particular ecosystem, which is like an interesting ecosystem where you have a kind of a highly managed agro-ecosystem potentially meeting a natural ecosystem, if you were to map it out, there's a number of exogenous and endogenous drivers and pressures on that system, and all sorts of linkages in terms of where people might get their food from, which relates to their health outcomes, and the implications on a whole range of services which are critical that way, and these are critical that way as well. So it's a very, very complex system, which actually 550 million, slightly more than Rob's deltas, which are 500. There's 550 million people living in this sort of environment. Oh, okay. So 5. Okay. I hope I get time for that extra delay there. So 550 million people around the world living this sort of setup. So what we want to do is actually use this as our focus, and I'll tell you the case studies we're using. But we'd like to think that in terms of the wider impact, that our actual the scientific approach that we are undertaking will have broader significance. So it can be a way that you can look at a whole range of ecosystems and how you manage them. And that's where it's very interesting to work and meet with the other consortia, because I think there are lots of opportunities for us to do that. So in terms of the 2 case studies, we homed in on Africa and Amazonia for very a complex range of reasons, but they both suffer from deforestation, although they may be at different ends in terms of the transition process. And the drivers such as climate change and poverty and malnutrition, inequality, etc., are drivers and pressures in both of those regions. And in the workshops which we were able to hold with our initial grant, which we got from ESPA, we were able to fine-tune into working in Colombia and Malawi in Africa, which I'll actually explain a little bit why. So in Malawi, we have a situation of which obviously a very poor country, suffering tremendously from undernourishment and an immense amount of deforestation going on, such that actually if you look at a transition from pristine forest to complete deforestation, one might argue that Malawi is right at one end of that, potentially gone beyond a tipping point in which deforestation has been so extreme that it's very hard to consider the managing that alongside all the other ecosystem services you might want. And what the purpose of this week and next week where we're going is to actually identify the specific regions in Zomba West where we will actually be homing in on some communities to work with. In Colombia, the situation is a little bit more understood in terms of the actual SEAT and Conservation International have been working in the areas we've chosen for the last 10 years. So there's a lot of existing data, there's a lot of expertise, and there's a lot of interesting insight which we can use in our project. But similarly, we had the opportunity of meeting the Colombian ambassador in the UK recently, and he was saying how climate change in terms of extreme flooding events is one of the biggest issues that is worrying them a lot in Colombia. And in Colombia, we're working, as I said, in the Caquetá region, and we have an interesting contrast here because what we have is Conservation International for 10 years have been working in the lower Caquetá. Is that right? It is lower. I've got it right. I know that's right. Good. Yes. Yeah, so in the lower Caquetá region, which is an extremely pristine area, very, very little damage has been undertaken. In fact, if you miss the plane, it takes 7 days by boat to get there. And Erwin, who works for Conservation International, has spent many years working with the local communities there. One of the most biodiverse places on Earth. If you come up to the upper Caquetá, many people call this the frontier line. It's where deforestation and agriculture is coming in very rapidly. And in some ways, it's quite a tricky place to work because of obviously some of the interesting politics and dynamics that are associated with that type of thing. But SEAT have been working there for many years and have the situation well sorted in terms of how to work in that type of environment. And in fact, as we'll tell you tomorrow, Carolina has been working with the Caquetá government and has already got our project built into the next 4-year development plan for that area, so which is quite nice to think that the impact can come about in a relatively short time frame. So what we decided to use is to use this DIPSIA framework to try and capture the problem and then structure it as to how we go about collecting the evidence base and linking it together, and then eventually linking through into terms of what responses you might make. Such we start off in the classic sort of looking at the drivers and the pressures, in which we use a range of qualitative and quantitative mixed method social science participatory workshops, household surveys, etc. I'll tell you a little bit more. Coupled with an FAO database quantitative model which looks at where calorific shortfalls might be, which obviously puts people under pressure in terms of where they might gather food from, and some socioeconomic surveys. And these together then begin to identify what drives and pressures there may be on the ecosystem that we're looking at. Then we actually can look at what the state and impact of these sorts of changes might be, and I'll talk through how we're using a range of models in their own context, individual models looking at hydrology, economics, and ecological processes, but also trying to integrate them. And it was interesting, Rob spoke about integrating models, but we have the Aries platform, which is a modeling platform which is enabling various models to talk to one another, so you can kind of integrate them together. And then that will begin to identify what sort of scenarios and outcomes and impacts you may have from the sorts of typical changes which are occurring. And then finally, there's the response side of things, which we can use some new ways of modeling risk and how you might put mitigation and adaptation into that, coupled with the issues surrounding policy change and governance, which then kind of completes the circle. And then we obviously have the issue of working at a range of scales over a range of time frames. So that first theme 1, is about looking at drivers and pressures and the linkages between food security, nutritional health, and ecosystem services. And to do that, we're answering a couple of questions. One, what are the current levels of direct and indirect contributions of ecosystem services to local food security and nutritional health outcomes for the rural poor, in which we have a couple of sub-questions which are part of these household surveys and participatory methods, which are live now in Africa, the original training sessions for those. And then the second aspect is what are the drivers and pressures that have the greatest effect on the ecosystem services that are most important for food security and health outcomes. And as I said, we'll be using a mixed method participatory research, both qualitative and quantitative methods, to try and understand the links and to derive some of the non-monetary values for some of these, as well as the monetary aspects, in which we'll be using focus groups, seasonal calendars, community timelines, matrix scoring, etc. And to give you an example of that, here we have an example in which you have a flooding event in Africa. Then you work with the community to kind of identify how they would deal with a situation like this and map it out, and then we can begin to learn from the sort of how people respond and how they might behave in future shocks and scenarios. The Feed Me model is being driven by Terry Dawson at Dundee, which is a model produced mainly at a national scale at this moment in time using FAO data, which is a way of trying to look into the future under various climate change or land change scenarios as to where you might get calorific shortfalls. One of the aims of the project is to begin to regionalise this, is to be able to bring it down into places like Kakita or Zomba in Malawi. Because when you often talk at the regional scale, and you've shown them the national scale, they say that national data is wrong. It's not what we do locally. So this Feed Me aspect occurring at a more local scale where you can influence change is an important thing to do, which is all based on the concepts of supply and utilisation. And then we have, which has briefly been mentioned before, we have a skilled group of demographers who have a lot of experience of working with communities and mothers and young children, and looking at how they address food security and maternal health and how they respond to various changes. And that will involve aspects of measuring people's health and well-being and working with infants in terms of measuring their outcomes. So we'll have some information during the duration of the project on those particular issues, but obviously that brings in lots of ethical questions as well, but that team are very experienced in how to do that. This is an example. So what's actually happening as I speak is that these are two big documents which have been produced, and they're being trialled in Malawi at the moment. And there's something which I know that Kate Schreckenberg and Carlos, who's the postdoc working on this project, are keen to consider discussing and sharing with the wider community. But it illustrates the kind of the process by which we will go through in terms of gathering the participatory information. So here we have the field manual, which is 62 pages long, in terms of how to gather the information, and then another document for the enumerators, which will actually record and log the information that's been gathered from all the communities that will be being worked. As you said, the draft is current this month, and it's actually the enumerators are being trained in Malawi right at the moment with these documents. Food security. What's happened? Food security surveys are the final aspect of this, in which, whilst the demographers are in the households measuring the well-being of the mothers and their children, they will be also gathering information, quantitative information about the food intake and of those communities. The second theme, as I said to you, is kind of around the aspects of crises and tipping points, and it's looking at past, present and future interactions. And the coping strategies and the future scenarios. And a lot of that is being driven by to what extent are coping strategies to food insecurity dependent on ecosystems, services over multiple spatial and temporal scales, and how are the levels of direct and indirect contributions of ecosystem services to local food security and nutritional health outcomes for the rural pool likely to change under future land use and climate change scenarios. And to do some of that, which is where we're going to hopefully be innovative and bringing in cutting-edge science. There's lots of ecosystem service models, Aries, Invest, etc. They all have their pros and cons. We've decided to work with the Aries team, which Miro here was very heavily involved in. We have the inventor of it, Fernando Villa, from the Basque Centre for Climate Change, who is on the project too. But the issue in terms of Aries is it's a rapid spatial assessment tool for ecosystem services and their values. It's not a single model, but it's an artificial intelligence assisted system that customizes models to user goals. So I think this is quite a good point in which you can have the models working independently and generating their stuff, and this is a way of integrating them together. Now, lots of people have some concerns about how easy or whatever it is to do that. I think what we've got is the belt and braces type approach, because we will have all the outputs from the models anyhow, and Aries can only add to that. It can't actually take anything away. And one of the big advantages of Aries is looking at this issue of the provision and the uses and the sinks and the flows by using probabilistic Bayesian models. And there's a whole range of detail here, which I haven't got time to go into today. But again, I think one of the advantages of us including Aries with the person who invented it is the actual person who's invented it has employed a Venezuelan postdoc who's working in Spain but is currently in Africa at the training workshop, who will be modifying the Aries program specifically for our needs. So it is a nice situation in which the complexity of this, which might be challenging for many people, is we actually are putting in the right amount of investment that is needed to see whether it will fly, or whether actually a very complex situation is maybe something Aries, which deals with single ecosystem services very well, how well it's going to deal with a complex range of services. But as I said, we have this belt and braces situation in which we will deliver whatever Aries manages to deliver. So here's the situation. So we have the provision shed and the benefit shed in terms of these, and sinks, and we have flows of ecosystem services. And one of the things that Aries is pretty good at is looking at this area of critical flow. So if you're looking to manage the ecosystem service, you could obviously look to where would be critical flow areas, which would be areas in which you'd want to actually manage very carefully to ensure that you get the maximum flow of ecosystem services that you want. So that brings me to the last theme, which is the science policy interface, and the question of how can we manage ecosystem services to reduce food insecurity and increase nutritional health, bearing in mind that we think that these are key drivers on ecosystem services in general. So I know there's some questions about it's all about food security. It's not. We think that food security drives land use change, and land use change is one of the key drivers affecting ecosystem services. So this is what we're trying to do here. And it's this question of minimizing the risk of future environmental change through influencing policy to better manage ecosystem service conflicts. Because I think most people are worried to talk about conflicts and trade-offs and these types of things. And I think we have to accept that if you're having a situation in which a landscape is being used by multiple people for multiple services, there's potential for winners and losers. And managing those trade-offs is going to be extremely important. We heard that from the two projects we'd heard earlier in terms of irrigation bringing its own disservices associated with it, and the deltas doing the same. So I think it's something we've got to hit and be willing to stand up and talk about, is the fact that actually there will always be trade-offs, and one has to make informed decisions on how that will be. And I think that's where these projects can have a big impact in a short term. I think is that in terms of that particular debate is contributing in a big way to it. So to actually tell you the questions that we are asking in relation to that third theme, it's sort of how can the risks associated with future environmental change be managed to minimize the effects on human beings and ecosystems, and how can we consolidate different levels of policy decision making at the local, regional, national and global scales. I think, again, one of the issues, and again it came up with the questions to the Delta team, is that many of these issues we're dealing with, there's a whole range of scales which they operate. Scales not just in terms of the ecosystem service operating over a range of scales, but the scales in which any management or governance is going to be across those range of scales as well. And we've had some very interesting conversations within the consortium about how to capture that. So you actually work with kind of the village community, the regional community, the government department community, the international communities, to see how you can kind of begin to join these up. And we don't actually have lawyers involved in that, so it'd be very interesting talking with yourselves in terms of how you, which we should be able to do because you don't actually live that far away from where we do, about the law side of things, which I think is an interesting concept. Okay. And then one of the things that we're very interested in, it's an innovative thing, is an aspect which I personally was involved in for looking at risks associated with genetic engineering. And what you have here is a situation in which, from various trials, we know that the management of a crop for herbicide tolerance has a range of environmental impacts, often associated with reduction in biodiversity. And what we used here is a bow tie risk management system, which is something developed by Shell to look at oil exploration and the risks associated with it, which began to map out the flows. And it's interesting, you see, we're talking about flows here, the flows of a hazard into the consequences of a hazard being realized. And what the idea is based on putting barriers in place to stop the consequences from ever happening. And you can do that by either stopping the event from ever happening. In this side, it's called pre-event mitigation. Or you can actually, the event happens and then you mitigate it somewhere else, which might be kind of the concept of land sharing, land sparing type ideas. So we will be kind of using this type of approach to look at the situation when you might have risks associated with a future scenario or a change. But one of the very innovative things we're hoping to do is potentially look at this rather than a risk management tool, but as a benefit management tool, in which this you can imagine being flows of ecosystem services. And currently there might be barriers in the place of the flow happening. So perhaps you can use tools like this rather than placing barriers. You actually look at how it can be used to remove barriers. So rather than just risk management, it can be benefit management, and therefore maximize the services that you want and minimize the disservices that you don't. And the target audience for our stakeholder engagement are community members through the village meetings, which we started doing. The team in Malawi informed us last night that they've just got funding to build a TV studio quite near one of our field sites. So next week we'll be producing a 30-minute documentary on ecosystem services. So impact immediately and all of that. Yes. And so that's kind of working at the local scale. We also have some national advisory board meetings. So we've got people from, I think, Carolina, you've got senior officials in Colombia involved in the advisory board in the Colombian part of the project. So we're kind of working with the national individuals there. And then we have an international policy makers in which we actually have a scientific advisory board of our particular project. We represent individuals from a whole range of different end users plus expertise who kind of, we'll be meeting them in December for the first time, who kind of work as a kind of a mentoring board to our project. And then obviously the academic beneficiaries. So our consortium will undertake what we'd like to think is world-class research on ecosystem services for poverty alleviation at the forest agricultural interface and deliver evidence from a range of sources and in various formats to inform policy and behaviour. And I think we'll have an interesting discussion tomorrow. But I think we're happy about the concept of providing the evidence in a format which can help inform. But obviously that's what you can be in a 4-year project. To actually influence and make a difference is a different issue from that, and will take a little bit longer. So just to give you a quick information of where we're at. So we've managed to appoint the principal new recruitees to the project. So we've recruited all 5 postdocs now. We have 2 in Southampton. Carlos is from Peru and Simon the UK. Eleanor, as I said, is from Venezuela. We're working in Spain. Delitzo is from Malawi, working in Malawi. And Gisela is from Peru, and she'll be working in Colombia. Gisela is just a recent winner of the L'Oreal Foundation award. So and all of the people we've managed to recruit are of exceptional standards. So I think one of the things that's really nice is that these projects are capturing the imagination of the early career researchers who want to be involved with projects of this nature. We also, our project never had any PhD students embedded in it, but we're already beginning to get the opportunity of people wanting to do PhDs associated with it. And we've got a couple of examples there, which is really good. And our colleagues in Colombia now are actually setting up a memorandum with the University of Nacional in Colombia to set up some students within Colombia who can kind of benefit from one student from within Colombia. You can ask Carolina about any of the questions on that. Timeline, so we started on March the 31st. We had a meeting in Southampton in May. We've hired the staff. We're at this workshop now, and the rural appraisal methodology training workshop's happening at the same time in Malawi. The spatial modelling workshop, of which several of us are coming, is occurring in October. And then by the end of this year, we think we will be then out of an inception phase and more into the actual kind of data-driven part of the project. Examples of major scientific output in the last 3 minutes. We were quite lucky, is that we actually, well, I'm happening to be chairing a Royal Society meeting in December on closing the gap between food security and ecological security. And several of the ESPA Assets project are invited to the Royal Society. And actually, we will be having our first paper in Phil Trans, as long as it gets through the refereeing process, in in 2013, which will have the kind of conceptual paper behind the project. And Conservation International and SEAT, and well, everybody will be involved in that paper, but also Ares and various other projects out of SEAT and Conservation International will be presenting in London as well. So it's an opportunity for the consortia to come together again to publish an early win paper in an open access journal. And obviously we hope, as many of us obviously envisage to do, to publish a whole series of high quality and high impact papers during the course of the project. The other things in shall we say, the less quantitative end of kind of, we all think about REF the whole time, but is that we think that we'll have a range of data, both secondary data which we're accumulating and some primary data which we'll be hosting on a server website which will be available to the community. The Ares development, again, if Ares can actually develop a specific model framework which can cope with the complexity of what we're doing, that will be a very powerful development for the ecosystem services community at large, because it will be proof of how these models can do that. The risk management tool that I spoke about, I think, would be particularly interesting, especially if one starts thinking about it in terms of benefit management as well as risk management. And I think the other thing is that we're quite keen on the idea of developing kind of conceptual frameworks or approaches which are simplistic but relevant. And we've started conversations. For instance, we're very excited about the Kate Raworth's incorporation of social foundations in a planetary boundary concept, you know, the so-called Oxfam donut. And again, we're quite excited about the opportunity of bringing in some of these sorts of ideas to our project, so that rather than wait 4 years and then think, oh, we should have done that, we're going to hit it right from the beginning. And I think that's where the social media, things like Twitter and that, surprisingly, can have a big impact, because that's where people suddenly can contact you and say, I've heard about your project, I've now looked it up, we're doing something, can you kind of start a conversation? Thank you.
I mean, this is a really interesting project around situations that, I mean, I've kind of worked on in the past. My question to you would be, are you going, I mean, I can see that you're going to be able to quantify and model in a sophisticated way trade-offs between food security and basically keeping forest intact. But where does one go from there? Because actually these trade-offs have, albeit perhaps less well quantified and documented and nuanced, have been well known for a really long time. Isn't this what the ongoing dissensus between conservation organizations and development organizations, debates about the relationship between poverty and conservation, have been on about for many, many decades? And there's often been a stalemate in actually trying to develop approaches which can move on from there. So this is my slightly challenging question to you. Maybe it's slightly more about impact. Is are you going to perhaps seek to identify some win-wins in terms of approaches which can reconcile these two traded off objectives? Are you going to look perhaps for some technical areas which could help? Are you going to be able to develop some new kinds of planning approaches, perhaps, or landscape segmentation? How do we get beyond the kind of integrated conservation with development programming that's attempted rather feebly, rather unsuccessfully, to deal with these trade-offs over a really long time? And how can your research help with that?
Is it, you want to?
Okay. I can answer your question in terms of policy and some work that we have been doing on modeling deforestation in Colombia. So the first thing that I think can be an interesting contribution is how are we thinking about these issues from the policymaker's perspective. And one reference I can make is climate change. Before, in Colombia at least, was only being regarded from the environmental sector. And now, after a policy, just recent policy document, it's being regarded as agriculture, environment, so the scope is getting broader. So I think a very interesting contribution from the project will be to look at this not only from an environmental policy perspective, but also the linkages that the health and environmental policies can have integrated into a more holistic development approach. I think that can be very interesting, because I can almost say, and I haven't really checked that yet, but I can almost say that there is no acknowledgement of that contribution of ecosystem services for food security and nutrition from the policy, health policy side. So I think that could be a very interesting approach. And then I agree on what you say, but I think the challenge is to really, in terms of prioritizing. So it's not like conservation anywhere, but it's really identifying where conservation really makes a contribution to keeping up those ecosystem services. So some things that we have been doing in Colombia with Terra is habitat change monitoring system, is that we can actually identify which places by deforestation the river flows are really affected in terms of flooding. And if you reverse that and you recover those areas, you can have flood control. So I think you can prioritize interventions that can really, it's not like, oh, you conserve here or there, but really prioritizing where and why.
Just before we,
yeah, I could add a little bit as well. I think we can learn a lot more about things like safety nets and coping strategies. Those concepts have been out there for quite a long time, but they've not always been particularly well documented. But we've got opportunities in the sites that we're working to actually work with the communities to find out how people deal with situations that are very challenging for them. For example, in Malawi, Lake Chilwa, which is a large lake, it's not huge like Lake Malawi, but it's pretty large by most standards, that dried up about 10 years ago, and it's reported that people then moved to other resources such as forest resources for survival at that stage, but that wasn't really documented particularly well. But that's actually happening again at the moment. If the current drought in Africa continues, Lake Chilwa could dry up altogether over the next 18 months or so, which will be very bad for the people who live there, but actually very fortunate for us because we'll be able to document that as it's happening at the moment. So by understanding things like that, that can then influence policies about what we do about the bits of forest that are still left. Should we make them more off limits but available, for example, when people really need them?
Very quick addition on that is that we're actually trying to also look at these tipping points, and without quantitative analysis and modeling of the nonlinear systems, you cannot get to those tipping points, and that we are hoping to make some progress on that.
Just before we take the next question, I can see that there are some people hopefully watching on the web. If you want to ask a question, just email Ruth on pa@espa.ac.uk and she can throw your question in, or else we can pick it up tomorrow and take that on. So particularly if anybody is actually watching in the early evening in Malawi. So is there another question in this room? Just wait for the microphone, yeah.
I was intrigued by the Ares, the AI approach. And I mean, I think maybe we can discuss further about this, but I think it's an issue, it's a challenge in all the projects here about integration, isn't it? I mean, it's come up, and I'm interested to learn a little bit more. What do you mean by AI, really? Because that covers a multitude of sins, shall we say? And and what exactly is it really doing? I just like a very, very briefly, a technical overview, and then maybe talk more offline.
Okay, well, I'm not an expert on artificial intelligence, but I did use Ares in my work, in applications in different landscapes around the world. And as Guy presented, it's a framework that actually can integrate, deterministic models, similar ones that were developed by, for example, Invest, or also probabilistic modeling, and all the models are integrated. Also, models are actually fitted also to data, and that's where artificial intelligence come to, it's activated in a way that it actually chooses the right fit to the number of variables, of data. For example, you will need more variables for the hilly terrain if you're trying to model some phenomenon, and less for the flat terrain, for example. And artificial intelligence will pick the right the driving variables rather than using all the variables for different parts of the world. So so it's one of the functions over there in that. But we can talk more.
I think that, yeah.
Another question. Just wait for the mic. You won't hear it.
Could you elaborate a little more about the tipping points, and particularly in what context you're trying to identify tipping points and how you will do it?
Okay, my idea of tipping points at this stage of the project, because it's still evolving, I think the science of tipping points still evolving, and I haven't found too much on it and how to model it, etc., except that my idea in tipping points in delivery of ecosystem services is to map the flow of that service across, let's say, landscape from the source to the beneficiaries, and then model the driving variables at the source or in the landscape to see if the future scenario of the development of the change of these driving variables will influence somehow the flow of the service. And if it does, I will look whether it's a nonlinear and see if there is any, and then start modeling the nonlinearity of that and see whether there's any tipping point.
Can I just say, have you thought about actually looking for tipping points in the whole social ecological system? So actually looking at how all of the interactions that exist between the forest fringe, and the people's activities can be treated as a whole, and to see whether there are tipping points in that. In other words, there are kind of alternative states that whole system can exist in.
Yeah, well, I have looked at the theory of the tipping points a little bit, and obviously we have the models, for each part of the system, and they interact with each other, obviously. So we will be able to do that. Hopefully, that's exactly what you're saying. It's like introduction of new technology. Yeah, that's could trigger that tipping point. There will be some early adopters, and then as it picks up, then obviously and if there are favorable conditions in the landscape, then it will trigger that tipping point. And we can talk more.
Yeah. I mean, things like that bow tie, you can look at that type of thing. So, for instance, you can have a hazard, shall we say, is a 40% removal of trees or something like that. Then you can actually look at the potential consequences associated with that, and then what's causing those flows, and then you can look at the barriers. You can actually look at the whole system and see if it's possible. I mean, there's little point putting in 4 or 5 barriers if the major flow is still going to happen and cause the consequence. So you'd have to consider the whole system. What you can do with that aspect, though, is often work out where the weakest link might be, which is it's not a tipping point, but it might be kind of in risk terminology, that's often called a trigger value. So it's the one which triggers the consequences that you wouldn't want to happen.
Yeah. But I think that question is useful too in terms of the policy work, in terms of advising for timely interventions. So really, when do you see the tipping point, let's say land degradation, and if you have policy interventions on time before you reach that tipping point, you can reverse the effects, and it can be so much cost effective than waiting until you reach that tipping point and then degradation just starts to grow so fast. So I think that's interesting to handle too from the yes, the preventive. Yeah, exactly.
I think that is talking conservation there, but I mean the classic conservation scenario in a bow tie concept is that you either protect the landscape to conserve what you've got, so you're actually pre-event, or a post-event aspect is the fact that the land goes, but you create some protected area somewhere of the right dimensions, which enables that consequence of losing pandas or whatever not to happen.
There's not many pandas in Colombia.
They're called glass bears.
Yeah. Yeah, spectacle bears. Yeah. Is there one last question? So I've got my chair's last question, which is the situation in Malawi and Colombia, very different in terms of both the ecosystems but also the human capacity, etc. What benefits do you see coming out of the working across two continents?
Well, I mean, Melissa's initial question, which was a challenging one, my view is that actually what we're trying to look at is this system of the agricultural forest interface, which goes from lower Capital, which is really just forest, upper Capital, in which agriculture is beginning to encroach, and Malawi, which has possibly gone beyond a tipping point. So we feel that the reason for going across the piece like that is it would be little use, as I see it, to do all of our work in lower Capital to talk about something which is is a very unusual scenario at one end of the spectrum. So we're hoping to see that the generic kind of nature of what we're doing, right from pristine frontier zone through to kind of an area which already had.
So where in Malawi are you expecting your field work to be mainly taking place?
In and around the Zomba area.
Yeah, I tend to agree that may have gone past the tipping point when I've looked.
But it's interesting because I went to Brazil earlier this year to some places in Sao Paulo state where there's actual sugarcane plantations which are now being changed back into agri-forest type schemes, and near to some of the protected forests. And the Sao Paulo universities are collecting quite a lot of data on those, and it's an interesting scenario in the fact that actually when someone has gone way beyond a tipping point, whether you can actually bring it back by putting in the right sort of policy.
Well, and there's an interesting link there, and we must move on. But when we were both in Brazil, I was at the ESPA, which is the Sao Paulo State Research Foundation, with Sir John Beddington, and he was there to launch to announce a program linking for ESPA and NERC, which is looking at reforestation of the Atlantic rainforest, which is looking at that. And they were really interested in the links between ESPA's activities and their research. There's another piece of a link there.